My grandfather was a kind, generous man. He was the type of grandfather who would slip you a sweet or a cookie after your parents had already said no, with a quick wink and a finger to his lip. The kind of old man who'd roll up his sleeves and get stuck in helping your dad fix the car or put some shelves up, even well into his 80s. He had a slight stoop, a shock of white hair, and a deep, throaty laugh. Those are the things that I remember most clearly about him. That and his penchant for dressing sharp. You never saw him without a shirt and a tie, or a sports jacket, a suit. He wore suspenders rather than a belt to hold up his pants. Just occasionally, he'd freeze up. I don't really remember when I first noticed it, but it was really bizarre. One minute he'd be chatting away, happy to my mom and grandma, a mug of hot tea in his hand, and the next, he'd just stop, frozen in time, as his eyes glazed over. Even more weirdly, the conversation would continue to flow around him, as if nothing had happened. A few minutes later, maybe up to a half hour, he'd unfreeze and rejoin the conversation, his tea now cold and forgotten. He drank a lot of cold cups of tea. I asked my mother about this once, and she told me that sometimes Granddaddy froze up because of what he'd seen in the Army, and that it was a medical condition called shell shock. I didn't really understand what that meant at the time, but it seemed a suitable answer to my young, inquisitive mind, and I didn't ask any further. Like many of his generation, he'd been to war. He didn't talk about it much, but I remember once seeing his medals in a drawer, tarnished and gathering dust, and I wondered why he didn't take better care of them. I found out later that, like many young men, he'd volunteered in the summer of 1914, and he'd been sent out to France as part of the new service battalions, just in time for the great reaping of souls known as the Battle of the Somme. I snuck in once, years later, and pulled out the medals so that I could take a good look at them. There were 3. A bronze star with 2 swords across it, a silver one, and a gold one. There was also a dull bronze strip, about 2 inches long, but very thin. I wondered what the medals were for, and this was the days before Google. I had to go down to the library to look them up. The librarian recommended a stuffy old tome with dull black and white pictures, but it depicted quite clearly the medals I'd seen in my grandfather's drawer. According to the book, they were the British War Medal, the British Victory Medal, and the 1914 Star. They were the standard campaign medals awarded to most British servicemen serving around 1914. I found myself slightly disappointed that they were not issued for some heroic deed, but I still wondered why he'd shoved them in a drawer and forgotten about them. And then I remembered the bronze strip and flicked through the book in the hopes of finding an illustration. Sure enough, there was a picture of a similar strip. According to the book, this was a wound stripe, awarded to soldiers who'd suffered an injury in battle. Suddenly, it all made a lot more sense, and I realized why he didn't like to talk about it with us. It also made more sense why he'd occasionally freeze up. I assumed it must just be to do with the wound. My curiosity satisfied, I left the matter and soon forgot all about it. That Christmas, because I was 16, my dad let me have a few drinks with Christmas dinner, and afterwards the men sat round the table with a glass of whiskey and a cigar, and we told jokes and talked about world affairs and just generally enjoyed ourselves. This was the first time I'd been invited to stay, and it felt like a real privilege, being treated like one of the men. My mother, my grandmother, and my aunts left to chat in the kitchen and wash up, while my sister and cousins went into the lounge to play with their new toys. We chatted and joked and swore and laughed, had a great time just being guys. No wives or kids within earshot. I really felt I was part of something. Uncle Bob had just finished telling a risque joke about a barmaid when Granddad spoke up, and he said, "When I was in the war." We all turned to him, and our laughter subsided, and we prepared to listen to what he had to say. I learned later that after a few drinks, he'd occasionally start reminiscing about his war days, but never when Grandma or any of the kids were around. They were usually about some of the pranks they'd pulled on the sergeant or a drunken night on leave. This story was not like those. One night, the sergeant told us we were going on a night raid. Usual business, up over the parapet after dusk. Quick race of the enemy lines, maybe snatch a sentry for interrogation and unit identification. The brass always wanted to know who we were facing, and if it was a new unit or a reserve one, it might be worth planning an attack. I got tooled up with the rest of the lads, rifles, bayonets, some ammo in my pocket. None of our usual marching kit, as it might get snagged on a wire or make a sound and give us away. I was the number one on the Lewis gun, a big, heavy gun far too unwieldy to take on a raid. So I just carried my Webley revolver and a trench club I'd made by hammering hobnails into an axe handle. The thought of this made me slightly queasy. I'd seen photos of trench clubs in the library book, evil-looking blunt instruments with vicious spikes. It's difficult to contemplate how someone as kind and gentle as my grandfather could have made one of those for the express purpose of breaking bones and caving in skulls. We went forward through the churned earth, past the corpses of Germans' last attack. I remember my mate Harry slipped on some poor guy's entrails and swore under his breath. The sergeant gave him a dark look for making the noise, and we all smiled, thinking about the hell he'd get when we got back to our lines. We were all shitting ourselves with fear. You always did when you went out on a raid, so anything seemed funny at that point. When you see your mates die every day, when a shell or a bullet or a bomb could kill you at any moment, you learn to live with fear. You get used to it. But stepping out onto no man's land, that's another fear altogether. You feel naked, alone in the universe, and it feels like every sniper in the German army is drawing a bead on you, ready to blow your head off. It's enough to drive a man mad. All talk had ceased round the table at this point. Everyone was listening in, enraptured by my grandfather's speaking. He was staring into the middle distance as he spoke. He'd frozen up earlier in the day, when my sister had squealed over a new gift she had received. His face was the same now, except for his mouth moving as he spoke. This time, it was even worse. We all felt it. A cold fog had rolled in over no man's land, which any other time would seem like a blessing as it masked our movements from the Germans. But that night, it seemed ominous, malevolent. We kept moving forward. We couldn't see the enemy lines through the fog, but we knew they were close, so we kept low and slow. As we moved up, I began to see a shape emerge from the fog. The sergeant saw it too, waved us down into a holding pattern. We all drew a bead on the shape. After a few moments, we got the nod and began to move up. As we got closer, we began to make out the shape of a man. He didn't seem to be doing anything, just standing, alone, staring at us. I'm not prone to superstition, but it was so creepy. I looked at the Sarge and he nodded to me. And I thought, shit, I've got to investigate. I stepped closer and began to make out a little more. It was a German uniform with one of the old spiked helmets still on its head. I began to make out the features on his face, and I could swear that he was smiling at me. I took another step and felt something shift under my feet, and I nearly pissed myself. I didn't dare look down to see what it was. I didn't want to take my eyes off of what was in front of me. Another step closer, gripping my weapons with white knuckles. I suddenly noticed it. I nearly laughed out loud as the tension drifted away. He was hanging up on barbed wire, caught up in the entanglements and dead as a doorknob. I heard the tales of this from some of the old sweats, men getting so entangled when they died that the wire kept them standing up. I felt so relieved. I carried on towards him in my giddy state. I figured that the helmet would make a good souvenir. When I grabbed the spike, the head fell back. He trailed away, and for a moment we thought he was having one of his moments. But then he looked directly at me, focusing for the first time, and I felt dread clawing up my spine. He didn't have any eyes, just two gaping holes as if they'd been ripped out by something or someone. I felt the courage of a moment before drain out of me, and I dropped the helmet, and it clattered on the ground. I'd seen a lot of bodies by this point, some of them close friends, but something about this one seemed different. Wrong. The feeling of being watched crept over me again, and I wondered if this was some new and evil trap the bastards had set up for us. I wanted to crawl up into a ball and hide, but I couldn't let my mates down. I turned around to see where they were, but the fog was thicker now and I couldn't see them anymore. I had to find them, let the sergeant know what I'd seen. So I began making my way back towards them. I looked back occasionally, a sixth sense not wanting me to look away from the corpse behind me. At this point, my granddad was staring back into the middle distance again, and I glanced at my father, but the look on his face told me this was a tale he hadn't heard before, and the color had drained from his face. I'd moved about 20 yards when I realized I should have come across them by now. I looked back, but the corpse had disappeared back into the fog and I was alone. I assumed that the sergeant had decided to call off the raid as the fog had gotten worse and that they'd left me behind. Anger at being abandoned overcame my fear, and I strode forward. I saw a shape ahead of me. I assumed it was the rear guard of the unit, so I redoubled my pace, hoping to catch up to him. As I moved closer, I realized he wasn't moving and he was hung up on the wire. And with a sigh of frustration, I assumed I'd been turned around in the fog and somehow made my way back to the corpse. So this time I resolved to go and grab that helmet so I'd at least have something to show for this whole mess. But as I approached, I began to feel that same sense of deep unease that I had before. And as I got closer, I realized why I was feeling so uncomfortable. It was a different man. Same pose. Same sightless grin. But this man wasn't the German I'd seen before. He was wearing a British uniform. I vomited, not because he was dead, but because the blood seeping from the eye sockets was fresh, but because it wasn't just anybody. It was my friend Harry. I felt sick. Harry had been on patrol with me. How could he now be strung up on wire like this? I tried to pull the fat, rusty strands of wire off him, but all I succeeded in doing was tearing my hands. My club and revolver were useless, and I wished I had some wire cutters or even a knife. I fell at his feet and I wept. I had no idea where our lines were in the fog, and I was helpless to do anything for my friend. And as I lay there, tears streaming down my face, I heard a shrill scream that chilled me to the bone. I was frozen in place, terror overtaking all other feelings. I could have been there for hours or minutes. I couldn't tell. Then I heard that scream again, and this time it triggered something in my brain, and I got up and I ran. I didn't care anymore. I'd prefer a German bullet in my brain than let whatever was out there catch me. It felt like I ran for hours, stumbling over the shell holes and the dirt of no man's land. Eventually I heard an English voice call out, and I called back that I was a friend, and stumbled into the front line trench. I was battered and bloodied and worn from the wire, but I never felt so safe in a front line trench in all of my life. I was the only man from my unit to ever return. Granddad paused for a moment, long enough that we all looked at each other, wondering if the story was over. It had grown overcast outside, and it felt cold in the dining room, despite the fire crackling in the grate. The pause lasted so long. I was desperate for someone to break the silence, and just as it looked like Uncle Bob would break it, Granddad spoke again. 2 weeks later, we mounted an attack on the same sector. I took a round in my shoulder in the confusion, and I lay in a shell hole for a day before the stretcher bearers found me. I'd lost a lot of blood and was swimming in and out of consciousness. When I came to, I had a hole in my shoulder. A little bit of brass to say I'd been wounded in combat. And I had this. He pointed to a faded white scar above his left eye. Something had tried to gouge out my eye. I never forgot the story my grandfather told me about his night lost in no man's land and the horrors he witnessed there. He never spoke about it again, and although over the next few years, after a few drinks, late in the winter evenings, Uncle Bob tried to ask him about it, he'd always refuse. The last time Uncle Bob asked, the room went quiet and suddenly felt very cold, and Granddad's gaze went dead in exactly the same way as it would when he froze up. "No, I don't want to talk about it. Please don't ask me again," he said very quietly. Conversation was stilted for the rest of the evening, and eventually he'd leave in an awkward silence. Nobody, not even Uncle Bob, ever asked him about it again. I was 19 when my granddaddy passed away. I was a year into college and the first member of my family ever to go, and I felt the weight of the expectation on my shoulders, especially from my granddad, who'd been over the moon when I told him I'd been accepted. "They probably got you confused with a smarter guy with the same name," he joked, but you could see how proud he was. It meant so much to him that one of his grandchildren had managed to get so far academically. He'd left school when he was 12, he used to tell us, to apprentice as a riveter in a shipyard. My first year hadn't been too bad. I enjoyed myself, I made friends, and I got drunk and met girls. My courses were good too. The first year hadn't been as hard as I was expecting, but now the second year had kicked in, and the workload had started to rise. Still, studying history wasn't a hardship for me. I'd enjoyed it ever since researching my granddad's medals when I was younger. There was something captivating about flipping through dusty old tomes, hunting for evidence. like some kind of historical detective. The news he'd died hit me hard. My dad worked long hours at the post office, and my mom was always busy with cooking and cleaning and looking after my younger sister, so I had spent lots of time with my grandparents when I was growing up. He used to tell me these long, elaborate bedtime stories about King Arthur and knights and dragons. He'd helped nurture my love of history, buying me books about ancient Rome and Egypt. Looking back, they must have cost him a sizable chunk of his pension. The funeral itself was a somber affair. The family was all there, and I read a heartfelt eulogy, which everyone said was very moving, but in truth, I just felt empty. I couldn't cry. I just couldn't feel anything. It was like my emotions had just shut down. A few months later, I was back at college studying for an essay. I picked a module on the First World War, partly as a tribute to my granddad, and partly because I'd done a lot of reading about it, thought it would be an easy credit. It wasn't. The professor was a real hard ass, and with Granddad now passed away, a lot of the pictures and accounts somehow struck closer to home. He lived through this, I remember thinking as I leafed through a hefty pictorial history of the war. Then I saw an image which stopped me in my tracks. It was of a soldier being crucified. The hairs on the back of my neck rose, and in my mind I was suddenly back in the room at Christmas with Granddad telling his story. Soldiers hung up on barbed wire as if crucified, and their eyes had been gouged out. I started to feel uneasy. I was working by the light of a desk lamp, and the shadows of my darkened room began to feel threatening. My eyes darted to the text below. Apparently, an officer of the Canadian Corps was seen by 3 witnesses crucified to a tree with bayonets in April of 1915. But there was no conclusive proof, such as a crucifixion, actually occurred. The eyewitness accounts were somewhat contradictory, and no crucified body was found. I read further, but the text then went on about other British and American propaganda, and there was no mention about the officer's eyes. Perhaps this was a coincidence, I thought, or it was just a rumor, or pure propaganda to make the Germans out to be monsters. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking back to the fear in my granddad's eyes as he told us the tale. The darkness in my room felt malevolent, and I played the story over and over in my head. Over the next few weeks, I pretty much read through every book in the library about the First World War, looking for more information about crucified soldiers. I neglected my friends and my coursework. I was utterly single-minded. I had to find out more. And although I found plenty of references to the crucified Canadian, it was all in the form of propaganda, and I could find nothing about any other cases. Dejected, I went back to working on my lackluster essay and handed it in. I didn't do very well on the essay at all. It was clear my heart wasn't in it, and my professor asked me to come in to talk about it. I wasn't very forthcoming, and I could tell he was becoming frustrated with me. "You're a good historian, but this last essay was very poor. Your references were all over the place, and your argument was very weak and full of missed opportunities," he was saying. I merely nodded and mumbled something about not being confident. "It's not about confidence," he said. "It's just about reading the sources. You should have known all of this if you've done the reading." "I did the reading," I retorted. "I just got distracted by something else, and I just thought, screw it." And I told him about the crucified Canadian and that my granddad had seen something similar. I didn't tell him the full story, though. He went very quiet and stared at me for a moment. And then he began digging through some papers behind him, And I waited for a second, and he didn't say anything, so I got up and turned to leave, annoyed that he dismissed me in such a rude manner. And he said, "Wait." And I turned, and he had a stack of handwritten paper stapled together in the top left corner, and he handed it to me. "Read this," he said, "and I want to see a marked improvement on your next essay." I left, confused, and I went back to my student housing. Once in my room, I looked at the sheet of paper the professor had given me. It was an old yellow sheet of paper, and the first page was in German, and I laughed. The old prick was getting one on at me for not reading primary sources, and it was obviously his way of saying I should learn German so I could read more about both sides. I very nearly threw it in the trash, but as I picked it up, I noticed the back page was in English, and I took it to my desk and I looked it through, and I realized it was a transcript of an interview in German which had been translated into English, and I began to read, and as I did, a chill began to run down my spine. I've copied the English translation. It's an interview with Gunther Müller, the 17th Infantry Regiment, a German soldier. As we charged forward, a shell must have gone off near me, as I was stunned and thrown to the ground. I don't know how much time had passed when I came to, but I had dirt in my eyes and mouth, and a pain in my right leg. The din of battle was still around, and I remember the ground shaking with concussive blasts, the chatter of machine guns, and the barking of rifle fire. I tried to move, but the pain in my leg was intense. I wiped some of the dirt out of my eyes and looked down. Blood was welling up and staining my field gray trousers in a few places. It didn't look life-threatening, but my leg spasmed in pain every time I tried to move it. I felt exposed and very alone. I couldn't find my helmet, and looking around, my rifle had been shredded by the blast and was now little better than kindling. I realized I had been thrown into an abandoned trench, now somewhere in the middle of no man's land. I was unarmed and injured, so I needed to get back to my own lines, but I was in no fit state to make it back in daylight. There was another man from my unit lying nearby, but he was dead. He was missing half his head. Shrapnel wounds are horrific. They don't put pictures of them in the history books. Much better to be shot with a bullet than torn up by a shell. I looked around a trench to see if there was somewhere I could hole up until the evening, and either the stretcher bearers would find me or I could crawl back to my own lines. The trench had been shelled heavily, and the wood supporting the sides had been badly broken up. It looked like one of ours, too, as despite the destruction, the underlying workmanship was much better than the English and French trenches. One large piece of corrugated iron had fallen down and was resting on the duckboards and the parapet wall, but from where I was lying there looked to be darkness behind it. I crawled over to it, dragging my leg behind me, and grabbed the corrugated sheet. To my surprise, it moved easily. Behind it was what I had been hoping for, the entrance to a dugout. I hoped it had been bombed into oblivion by shelling, and that I could lay low in there until nightfall. I wished now I had braved the crawl back to my own lines and never stayed in that godforsaken pit. I began to crawl under the iron and down the wooden steps. They were intact. The iron sheet must have given them some protection from shrapnel. It was pitch black down there. As I carefully crawled down the steps, the temperature cooled and the air felt damp. I could still feel the earth rumbling from the bombardment, but the other sounds of battle faded the lower I got. It took my eyes some time to adjust to the blackness of the dugout. When they did, I nearly jumped out of my skin. There was a man, sat in the dark room, looking at me. I panicked and immediately raised my hands to show I was unarmed, but he just sat staring. I was sweating and paralyzed with fear. My eyes continued to adjust to the blackness, and I realized with a wave of relief that he was dead. He must have been that way for a while. His skin was stretched over his skull, and he had no eyes. Perhaps the rats had gotten to him. I was quite used to seeing death at this point. I think they call it desensitized. He was sat against a desk, and by the looks of things, this had been an officer's dugout. There were some home comforts I could make out in the gloom, even a gramophone on a table in the corner. I could see no other bodies, alive or dead, in there, and I remember it striking me as odd that he sat so upright and still, even in death. I used the table to pull myself up, taking my weight on my good leg, and as I did, I felt something on the table and picked it up. It was a pistol, an officer's weapon, not as common as the Luger, but I'd seen one before. I took the clip and saw it was still loaded, so I tucked the gun into my leather belt at the front. I wasn't confident it would fire, but I could at least threaten someone with it, and it made me feel less naked. As I said, I was used to seeing death, but if I was going to be in here for some time, I didn't want a dead officer staring at me all day, so I decided to try and slide him off the chair and into the corner. I made my way around to him, using the table to take some of the weight off my injured leg, and I tried to push him off the chair, and his head lolled, but he didn't budge. That's when I noticed it. He had been bound to the chair with barbed wire. I should have gotten out of there right then, taken my chances with the guns and shells of no man's land, but I didn't. I think part of me thought maybe it was the scene of a mutiny or something. Maybe they'd tied up an unpopular officer and left him. It seems callous, but by then I'd served under some truly terrible commanders who would have deserved this or far worse. Maybe shelling had dropped the corrugated iron over the entrance and no one had come down here looking, and he'd starved to death alone, his dugout becoming his tomb. I pushed harder, and this time the chair toppled over and the corpse hit the floor with a sickening thud. I nearly overbalanced myself as I tipped, and I put some weight on my injured leg and nearly screamed out in pain. I half fell onto what would have been the officer's cot and lay there for a moment as agony coursed through me. The pain eventually subsided, and I lay in the cot thinking of home. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep, and when I awoke, it was with a start. I lay there, eyes wide, listening intently. The events of the day rushed back to me. Something had woken me, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I had this enormous feeling of dread inside of me. Some animal instinct was telling me that something was very, very wrong, that I wasn't alone. I glanced over at the officer's corpse, but it was still slumped in the corner, bound to the chair. I drew the pistol from my front belt and rocked back the slide. The trace of light coming down the stairs was no longer there. I realized I must have slept until dark. The sounds of battle from earlier and the rumbling of the earth had stopped. I got up carefully off the cot, my injured leg protesting as I carefully set it down and moved over to behind the table. I kept my gun trained on the door, expecting a Tommy to come bursting through at any moment. My senses were in overload. My hobnails crunching on the rotten wood of the floor seemed as loud as gunshots. I could hear something faintly outside, like movement in the trench above me. My mind was racing. A patrol above me, perhaps, investigating this old trench. Were they my side or theirs? Would they find me down here? Would they check, or would they throw a grenade down first? I was terrified, but I felt the urge to find out. If they were on my side, they could maybe help me back to our lines. And if they were Tommy's, well, at least I would know, and I could attempt to hide until they moved on. I resolved to carefully make my way up the steps and peek out under the corrugated iron. It was a lot more difficult than I imagined. I was trying to keep the pistol pointed ahead of me, drag my injured leg, and make as little noise as possible. It seemed to take a lifetime, and each time my leg hit a step, it was agony. Finally, I reached the top step and peered out into the darkness. There was something moving out there. My heart was beating so fast, and I could hear the blood pumping in my ears. He had his head back to me and seemed to be bent over doing something, but I couldn't make out what it was. There was something wrong, though. He didn't look right. I don't know how to explain it. I don't think I could quite process what I was seeing. His movements were wrong. His arms were elongated like a chimp. His head was moving in a strange, jerking motion. I must have made a sound. Or perhaps it sensed it was being watched because it suddenly stopped and its head whipped round. It wasn't human. It looked like it might have been at one stage, but the proportions were all wrong. Its eyes were too big, its face was sunken, its limbs way too long and too thin. I can't describe it perfectly, but years later, when I read Tolkien, it sounded exactly the way he described Gollum. Exactly. I know he fought for the British at the Somme. Maybe he saw it too, or something like it. I tried not to gasp at it, but I must have made some noise as its darting, two big eyes stared straight at me. And then it moved, unnaturally quick and almost feline, right towards me. Pistol in my hand, barked, and the bullet, more by luck than by my aim, hit it in the chest. It jerked back, let out the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard. I still hear that scream in my nightmares. The thing turned and scurried on all fours up the parapet of the trench and out into no man's land. I was almost paralyzed with fear, and I stayed still, gun pointing at where it had left the trench. After what seemed like an age, it didn't seem to be coming back, so I moved cautiously out into the trench. Once I did, I could finally see what it had been doing. It had been tying my dead comrade up with barbed wire. He was spread-eagled over a crude cross made of 2 rotting duckboards, his shell-damaged head lolling at an unnatural angle, his hands pierced through with bayonets, and his wrists bound by wire. His legs were still loose. I guess I had interrupted that thing before it had finished. I'd seen a lot of horror in this war, but right then and there I was just overwhelmed and I vomited. As I looked back up at the unnaturally hanging head, I noticed something. He was missing half his face from the explosion earlier, but something had changed. His remaining eye had been gouged out. I felt a shiver down my spine as I read the last line. The rest of the account dealt with his escape from the trench and the journey back to his own lines, and there was no further mention of the creature. I put the text down on my bed. My head was spinning. Corroboration of what my granddad had seen. Something taking eyes. A creature living in no man's land. And Tolkien may have seen one. I'd only recently reread The Lord of the Rings back then. Perhaps there were more accounts out there? It's been over 50 years, and although I've found a few other references, hints perhaps at something out there between the trenches, I never found anything like the accounts of my granddad and Gunther Müller. But I know my granddad was telling the truth. And to this day, I'm still looking.